Welcome, friends. We're so glad to have you here. We've prepared some incredible stories that we hope you'll enjoy. If you do, and you'd like to support the channel and help it grow, please consider subscribing. Your support means the world to us. I never imagined that a solitary hike, 100 miles from anywhere, could turn into a dangerous game of wits and survival. But there I was, trekking through a dense forest far from civilization, when the sound of lapping water lured me off the beaten path. The forest had been silent except for my measured footsteps and the rustle of leaves, until I stumbled upon a small, mirror-like lake tucked away in a secluded clearing. Floating gently on the still water was a modest rowboat. In it, a woman sat quietly, fishing with a grace that almost made time slow down. Her long, sun-kissed hair framed a face that was both delicate and striking, and her dark eyes held an alluring intensity. I paused on the bank, mesmerized by the unexpected beauty of the scene. Clearing my throat, I called softly, "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She glanced up, her smile warm and inviting. "It is," she replied, her voice light as the breeze over the water. "Not many wanderers come this way." I stepped closer, feeling the pull of curiosity and something inexplicably magnetic about her presence. "I was just hiking through," I explained, "and this lake, it's like a hidden gem." After a brief exchange, her name was Lila, she had been enjoying the solitude and the art of fishing, I found myself drawn into conversation. Lila spoke with a playful candor about the wilderness and the secrets that lay hidden among the trees. In turn, I shared stories from my past, including the time I'd spent years in the boxing ring, an ex-boxer who'd traded gloves for hiking boots in search of quieter battles. As the afternoon waned, Lila surprised me by inviting me to her cabin, which lay not far from the lake. "I have a small place by the water," she said with a hint of mischief in her eyes. "You must be hungry after your trek. Come, join me for a drink and a meal." Intrigued and a bit enchanted, I accepted. We strolled along a narrow, winding path until we reached a rustic cabin nestled amid towering pines. The cabin, though modest, exuded a comfortable charm. Weathered wood, a stone fireplace with a soft glow, and the gentle aroma of a home-cooked stew wafting from the kitchen. It was a scene straight out of a pastoral romance. Inside, we settled at a worn wooden table, and conversation flowed as easily as the wine she poured. Lila's laughter was infectious, and the gentle clink of cutlery and the soft crackle of the fire set a scene that felt both intimate and surreal. For a while, it seemed as if the isolation of the wilderness had woven a spell around us, a temporary escape from the world of responsibilities and expectations. But as the evening deepened, I began to sense an undercurrent beneath her charm. Between sips of wine and shared glances, Lila let slip a remark that sent a chill through me. "You know," she said casually, "sometimes I like to stir things up, to see just how far someone will go to win me over." She paused, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's all in good fun, of course, making my husband jealous when he finds out I can captivate another man." I blinked, taken aback by her offhand revelation. My mind raced. Was this just flirtation or a dangerous game? I tried to laugh it off, but an uneasy feeling took root. In the dim light, her eyes flashed with something that wasn't entirely benign, a mixture of mischief and something darker, like the thrill of control. Before I could probe further, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. Lila leaned in close, her voice soft and laced with an intensity that belied the earlier tenderness. "Tonight isn't just about good conversation," she murmured. "Tonight is a test, a game, if you will." Her eyes glittered as she continued. "I want to see if you can handle a challenge. Can you outsmart me or even escape me?" That moment, I realized that the romantic interlude had taken a perilous turn. My instincts, honed not only on the quiet trails of the wilderness but also in the gritty discipline of boxing, screamed that this was no ordinary flirtation. I had been lured into a scenario far more sinister than I'd anticipated, a trap designed to provoke and perhaps to capture. I attempted to steady my voice. "A game?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant even as my pulse raced. Lila's smile deepened into something predatory. "Yes," she replied softly. "I've been feeling neglected, and what better way to prove a point to my husband than to show him that I can entice and capture someone he never expected?" In that instant, I knew I had to get out. The The warm glow of the cabin suddenly became a confining cage. I rose slowly, feigning calm as I reached for the door. But Lila was quicker. With a swift, fluid motion, she lunged toward me. The playful glint in her eyes was now cold and calculating, her intent unmistakable. Adrenaline surged through me. Years of stepping into the boxing ring had taught me to rely on instinct, to react before the mind could overthink. I sidestepped her aggressive move, my body automatically tensing for defense. She advanced again, and I met her with a rapid series of blocks and evasive maneuvers. In the close quarters of the cabin, every punch and parry was a fight for freedom. Her attempt to restrain me, an unexpected twist in her game, was met with the full force of my training. I delivered a precise, controlled strike that knocked the wind out of her, enough to break her hold. Without a second glance, I bolted for the door, the echo of our struggle mingling with the low hum of the night outside. I burst into the cool, crisp air of the wilderness, my heart pounding in my ears. The moon, high and cold in the sky, illuminated the narrow path as I sprinted through the trees, adrenaline and fear propelling each step. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sounds of Lila's pursuit, a reminder that my escape was not yet secured. Navigating the rugged terrain, I relied on my familiarity with the land. I weaved between towering pines, leapt over tangled underbrush, and bounded along a barely discernible trail that I hoped would lead me to safety. Every so often I paused, listening for any sign that Lila was gaining ground. But the forest, vast and indifferent, swallowed her footsteps in its nocturnal chorus. After what felt like an eternity of desperate running, I emerged onto a narrow logging road. In the distance, the faint rumble of an engine reached my ears, a promise of civilization, of rescue. I increased my pace, not daring to look back until the comforting glow of headlights was upon me. Later, as I sat in the back of a pickup truck driven by a local ranger, I allowed myself to catch my breath. The surreal blend of romance, danger, and the wild had left me both shaken and oddly reflective. I'd set out on a hike seeking solitude and adventure, only to find myself entangled in a dangerous game, one that I narrowly escaped by relying on the skills I'd forged in the boxing ring. In the days that followed, the memory of that night at the lakeside cabin lingered like a half-remembered dream. I still questioned Lila's motivations, whether her dangerous game was meant to wound or simply to prove a point to a husband who remained unseen. But one thing was clear: the wilderness can hide secrets as deep as its still waters, and not every beautiful encounter is as innocent as it seems. Now, as I nurse my bruises and the echoes of that fateful night in quiet moments, I remain grateful for the instincts and training that kept me safe. The world is full of unexpected turns, and sometimes, when romance takes a dark twist, survival depends on the quick thinking and hard-earned skills of a fighter who knows when to run and when to fight back. I never imagined that one single evening could shatter the illusion of safety I'd carefully built around my life. I'd always been cautious about first dates, but after a few disappointing experiences, I convinced myself that I'd grown wiser. I even believed that I'd learned to trust my instincts until the night I met Jared. I had met Jared on a dating app, a profile full of seemingly thoughtful messages, candid snapshots of his travels, and a smile that radiated warmth. Our chats were light and engaging, and he came across as articulate, humorous, and genuinely interested. When we agreed to meet at the Ember, a chic yet unpretentious restaurant tucked away in a quieter part of town, I felt an excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I arrived early and claimed a small table near the window, where I could keep an eye on the entrance and remain in control of my surroundings. The dim amber lighting and soft murmurs of conversation lent the place an inviting air, and I thought, maybe tonight will be different. Jared appeared right on time, dressed in a casual but well-fitted jacket and a quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. His handshake was firm, his smile sincere, and his compliments were thoughtful rather than overdone. At first, our conversation flowed effortlessly. We discussed our favorite authors, the local music scene, and even shared a few quirky anecdotes from our childhoods. But as the courses passed, I began to notice subtle shifts in his demeanor, small details that sent an undercurrent of unease rippling through me. It began when Jared casually asked, So where do you live exactly? I mean, your profile said downtown, but it looks like you're really in the heart of the city. His tone was light, but the question felt invasive, as though he were trying to pinpoint my every move. I brushed it off as curiosity until he inquired further, details about my daily routines, the time I usually left work, and even whether I preferred walking home or taking public transit. I started to feel as if he were meticulously piecing together a profile of me that extended far beyond the confines of our conversation. As dessert arrived, a delicate shared slice of cheesecake, Jared's questions took on an unnerving edge. "Do you ever worry about safety when you're alone at night?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were measuring my response. I hesitated, my smile faltering for a moment. "I'm careful," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light, but internally, I was already scanning the room, aware of every unfamiliar face. His next words, spoken in a hushed tone that bordered on conspiratorial, sent a chill straight down my spine. "I just think it's important to know exactly who you're letting into your life, you know?" His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. Feeling increasingly trapped in a conversation that felt less like a first date and more like an interrogation, I excused myself under the pretense of freshening up. In the quiet of the ladies' room, I checked my phone for messages. Anything from my best friend Nina, who always had a sixth sense about these things, and found nothing. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, my heart pounding as I replayed every subtle warning sign. I tried to shake off the growing dread. After all, maybe I was overreacting. Perhaps Jared was just an overly inquisitive person, albeit one with an unsettling intensity. I returned to the table, determined to salvage the remainder of the evening. But when I sat down, I found that Jared's eyes had shifted, dark and unreadable, as if he were carefully weighing a decision. He abruptly mentioned that he preferred to drive, insisting on giving me a ride home. Part of me recoiled at the idea of riding in a car with someone I'd just met, but another part, still clinging to the hope that this might just be a harmless quirk, nodded in agreement. The drive started off unremarkably enough. Jared's car was a sleek, dark sedan that he navigated with the kind of precision that spoke of years on the road. Outside, the city lights blurred into a tapestry of color as we left the well-lit center for quieter, less populated streets. I tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his interests, but each attempt was met with curt, evasive responses. The radio played low, haunting tunes that seemed to underscore the growing tension. Then came a moment that would forever etch itself into my memory. As we merged onto a narrow, poorly lit road, Jared slowed the car to a crawl and turned onto a gravel path flanked by dense woods. My stomach knotted in alarm. I don't recognize this road," I stammered, glancing around at the oppressive darkness outside. Jared's smile was tight. "It's a shortcut," he said, dismissing my concern with a wave of his hand, but his tone carried an edge that made my skin crawl. The car's interior suddenly felt claustrophobic. I noticed the door locks clicking into place on their own as Jared drove deeper into a secluded area. Panic began to creep in slowly, like ice water spreading through my veins. I tried to mask my growing anxiety, asking, "Are you sure this is safe?" Jared's response was measured, too measured. "Relax. I know what I'm doing." His eyes, fixed on the road ahead, betrayed nothing. As we continued down the desolate road, my mind raced. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed before my eyes. The isolated, dark paths, the inescapable clutches of a predator who seems harmless until it's too late. My hands trembled on the seat, and I discreetly reached for my phone. With my thumb hovering over the emergency call button, I realized that I needed to act before my fear rendered me completely paralyzed. At the next curve in the road, Jared's phone buzzed, and he glanced down with a frown. In that moment of distraction, I saw an opportunity. I pretended to fumble with my purse, feigning a need to retrieve something important. With trembling fingers, I managed to unlock my phone and type a quick message to Nina. "Something's not right. I'm in a car with someone I barely know. Please call me." I could barely see my screen in the dim light, and every second felt like an eternity. Jared caught my movement out of the corner of his eye. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone suddenly icy. I forced a smile and nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. But my mind was screaming at me to escape. I needed a plan, any plan, to get out of that car and away from that man. As we rounded another bend, the gravel road gave way to a stretch that ended abruptly at a low, rusty gate. Jared slowed to a stop, and he turned to me with an intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low and dangerous. My pulse pounded, and every instinct screamed at me that I was in grave danger. I tried to steer the conversation back to something neutral, asking about the area, but Jared's eyes darkened further. In a heartbeat, I knew that this was no longer just a misguided shortcut. It was a trap. The door handle on the passenger side was suddenly within reach, and I made a split-second decision. As Jared's gaze locked on mine, I pretended to fumble for my purse again, but this time I produced a small canister of pepper spray that I'd stashed for emergencies. "Jared, can you pass me the—" I began, voice shaking as I reached over, but before I could finish, he grabbed my wrist with a strength that belied his calm demeanor. His grip was iron tight, and the sudden rush of adrenaline surged through me. I managed to twist my arm free just enough to spray the pepper spray directly into his eyes. His grip loosened instantly as he recoiled in agony, shouting, "What the hell?" I didn't wait for his reaction. I kicked his arm as hard as I could and yanked the door open. The cool night air hit me like a jolt of reality. "I'm getting out," I hissed, scrambling out of the car. Jared lunged after me, but I sprinted toward the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would alert anyone nearby. My mind raced as I ran through the darkness, the sound of Jared's footsteps pounding behind me. Every step was a desperate plea for survival. I fumbled with my phone again, this time dialing 911 with trembling fingers, whispering into the receiver that I was in danger and needed immediate help. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline as she assured me that help was on the way. The woods around me were thick, and I didn't know the area well. I could hear Jared calling out my name, his voice distorted by anger and frustration. I didn't dare look back. Instead, I focused on reaching the street lamp, then a nearby main road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst onto a well-lit street where cars passed by in a comforting flow of headlights. I flagged down a car, a kind stranger whose concerned eyes met mine, and I scrambled into the passenger seat, gasping out my story. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights shattered the darkness as police cars and an ambulance arrived. Officers took my statement, and I was finally able to see Jared being detained, his wild eyes filled with a mix of rage and disbelief. The terror of that night began to recede as I realized I was safe. In the days that followed, I was overwhelmed by a swirl of emotions: relief, anger, and a lingering vulnerability. The experience had left scars, both visible in my trembling hands and invisible in my shaken confidence. But it also reinforced the importance of trusting my instincts, of always being prepared for the unexpected, and of knowing that it's okay to fight for your own safety. With the support of friends, family, and a compassionate therapist, I slowly rebuilt the shattered fragments of my trust in the world. I became more cautious, yes, but I also discovered a strength within me that I hadn't known existed. I took self-defense classes, learned new strategy, I'd always prided myself on being cautious, and yet, desperate for a change, I booked a week-long singles cruise. I was ready for adventure, connection, maybe even romance. I thought a change of scenery and the promise of like-minded souls would be the perfect antidote to my routine. Little did I know that the sea horizon would become the stage for a nightmare I could never have imagined. Stepping aboard the ship, I was struck by the opulence and carefree energy that defined every inch of the vessel. The lobby buzzed with animated chatter and laughter as singles from all walks of life mingled under the gentle hum of ambient music. I introduced myself with a smile, eager to start fresh, and found myself instantly swept up in the excitement of possibilities. During the first couple of days, the cruise was everything I'd hoped for. Daytime cocktail parties, themed dinners under glittering chandeliers, and spontaneous late-night gatherings on the deck. Yet, amid the buoyant festivities, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with a whisper of unease during one of the evening mixers. I'd been chatting with a few fellow cruisers near the pool deck when an offhand remark caught my attention. A man in a crisp blazer mentioned that a couple of guests had mysteriously vanished after a late-night game of charades. At first, I dismissed it as idle gossip, a quirk of being in a confined, insular environment. But that night, as I walked alone along a dimly lit corridor to my cabin, I couldn't help but feel as though unseen eyes were tracking my every move. My suspicions began to solidify on the third night. I had just returned from a lively dinner when I noticed a figure in a dark coat lingering near the elevators. He wasn't part of the scheduled entertainment or the usual cast of partygoers. His posture was unnervingly still, his eyes hidden behind tinted glasses even in the dark. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by cruise fever, but deep down, a shiver of dread began to settle. The real turning point came during the ship's midnight masquerade, a glamorous affair meant to spark intrigue and flirtation. Amid the glittering masks and sparkling costumes, I found myself drawn into conversation with a perceptive woman named Jessica. Her warm smile belied a cautious seriousness that resonated with my own unsettled feelings. Over whispered confidences beneath the glow of antique chandeliers, she asked, "Have you noticed that sometimes it feels like someone's watching us?" Her eyes searched mine, silently asking if I, too, felt the creeping tension that had been mounting over the past few days. I admitted that I had seen a man in a dark coat who seemed to appear at the most unexpected times. Jessica's expression darkened as she confided that she'd heard hushed rumors about a passenger, someone who had been following a pattern of isolating vulnerable guests. By the end of the night, we agreed to keep a closer watch and share any details that might help us understand what was happening. The following day, I began casually questioning a few acquaintances about the odd occurrences. I learned that at least 2 other passengers had reported unsettling encounters. Furtive glances from a stranger in the corridors, whispered conversations in empty cabins, and, most disturbingly, the unexplained absence of a couple of guests who'd been last seen alone after midnight. My mind raced. Was this just a series of coincidences, or was someone deliberately targeting people on the cruise? That evening, as the ship's engines hummed steadily in the dark and the moon cast eerie shadows across the deck, I resolved to confront my fear. I discreetly positioned myself in a less crowded section of the upper deck, keeping my eyes peeled. It wasn't long before I spotted him again. The same man in the dark coat, standing near a row of potted plants as if waiting for something. My pulse quickened as I realized that this was no random fellow enjoying the ambiance. His gaze was unnervingly focused, as if he were scouting for his next victim. Unable to ignore the danger, I messaged Jessica, suggesting we meet near the ship's quiet library, a small, secluded nook that overlooked the silent ocean. When she arrived, her face was etched with worry, but together we pored over our observations. Our whispered conversation was punctuated by the distant sound of waves lapping against the hull and the low hum of the ship's engines. We compared notes, the same man seen at different times, the pattern of mysterious disappearances, and the unnerving sensation of being stalked. Deciding we couldn't wait any longer, we approached the ship's security desk. In hushed tones, we relayed our concerns and the disturbing pattern of missing guests. The security officer's face darkened as he listened, and he assured us he would look into it immediately. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that by alerting the proper authorities, we might soon reclaim the festive, carefree spirit of the cruise. But as midnight approached, a sudden commotion shattered any fragile sense of safety. I was jolted awake by frantic shouts echoing through the corridors. Rushing toward the source of the disturbance, I found a small crowd of passengers gathered near the aft deck, their faces pale in the glow of emergency lights. There, emerging from the shadows of a narrow service corridor, was the man in the dark coat, now visibly agitated, his eyes wild with a mix of determination and something far more sinister. Without thinking, I shouted a warning to Jessica, and together we dashed after him, our footsteps echoing off the metal walls of the narrow passageways. The corridor twisted into a labyrinth of doors and storage rooms, each turn heightening the suspense. I felt the adrenaline surge through my veins as I followed him, aware that every second counted. At one point, he darted into a cluttered storage area. I followed, heart hammering in my chest, and immediately regretted it when the door swung shut behind him. Inside, the space was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, casting long, eerie shadows across stacks of crates and forgotten luggage. As I crept forward, I discovered scattered personal belongings, a leather wallet, a wristwatch, even a silk scarf, items that unmistakably belonged to one of the missing guests. Before I could process the grim evidence, a figure lunged from behind a crate. The man in the dark coat had caught up with me. His grip was iron-like as he attempted to wrest control, his intentions unmistakably violent. In that desperate moment, the fear that had been building inside me transformed into a survival instinct. I struggled with every ounce of strength, adrenaline surging through my limbs until I managed to break free. My voice, raw and urgent, called out for help just as Jessica's determined shout joined the cacophony. Within moments, security personnel, alerted by our earlier report and our frantic cries, burst into the storage room. The attacker, caught off guard by the sudden influx of light and voices, faltered. In the ensuing scuffle, I managed to hold him down until the officers secured him. His eyes, wild and accusatory, revealed a disturbing truth. He was a disgruntled ex-employee of the cruise line, dismissed years ago for unprofessional conduct and harboring a twisted vendetta against the company. His random targeting of vulnerable guests was his perverse way of lashing out, and on this cruise of hopeful souls, he had found a stage for his dark theatrics. As the night's terror began to recede, I stood on the deck at dawn, watching as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. The ship slowly resumed its intended course, and the remaining passengers gathered in relieved clusters, grateful for the safety restored. Jessica and I exchanged weary smiles, a shared acknowledgement of the harrowing ordeal we had just survived. In the days that followed, as the cruise neared its final port, I found solace in the unexpected bond that had formed between Jessica and me. Our shared experience on the sea horizon had forged a connection that went far beyond the fleeting excitement of a singles getaway. We continued to talk, laugh, and rebuild our sense of security, both aboard the ship and after we returned to solid ground. Back home, I carried with me the scars of that night, but also a renewed appreciation for life, resilience, and the unexpected ways in which fear can bring people together. I discovered within myself a strength I never knew I had, and with Jessica's friendship, and perhaps something deeper on the horizon, I learned that even in the darkest moments, hope and safety can prevail. Now, as I sit in a quiet cafe reflecting on that surreal voyage, I know that the sea horizon will forever be etched in my memory, not solely as a vessel of terror, but as the place where I learned to trust my instincts, fight for my safety, and ultimately find a path to a brighter, more secure future.